draft right there, always. Like not just because our kids, yeah, it's something noise.
Alrighty, well, we have a whopping 20 minutes to blaze through this stuff, so let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunities that you give us to speak your truth to others. Help us to have the courage, the wisdom, and the knowledge to defend our faith and give reasons for the hope that we have. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, well, trying to think with how little time, what do we want to focus on? All right, very quickly, we're moving in. You remember last time we kind of started talking about trouble spots that people have. Some of those were, is there really a God? Does science make faith kind of unreasonable? Is the Bible reliable? What do we do about the problem of evil? I don't remember what the other one is off the top of my head, but it's written down, so I'll remember it next week. We're going to kind of start moving through these trouble spots one at a time, and I can't promise you we'll get through every single thing on every single one each week just because of the limited time, but I want to make sure that you guys have a chance to actually hear some specific arguments being made. So I'll blitz through the foreword and some of the other stuff here, just so we can move into the meat of all of this. First of all, I just want to remind you that any arguments that you hear from this, you can use them, you don't have to use them. There's not a script. You're not going to meet a person where you can just go, okay, my name is Stephen Rutherford. Here's point A, B, C, and D, and now you have to be a Christian. You have to remember, of course, you're always dealing with real-world people, and by and large, like I said, most of this is just going to happen in the midst of regular conversations. You might just be sitting there talking about things. Have you ever thought about what God is or why there's all these stars? And things just happen. The reason for this is not to give you a script to follow. It's to give you tools in your toolbox so that when you're in that situation, you might have a relatively solid idea of how to deal with these things, okay? So one of the things that's always useful I don't expect you to take formal courses in this, but one of the things that's really helpful to read for your own faith, for helping to explain faith to other people, for so many aspects of life, are rhetoric and logic. Do you know what rhetoric is? Rhetoric is the art of speaking well and persuasively. There is no form of life you will be in where learning rhetoric, to speak, present your arguments and your statements clearly and persuasively, will be a bad thing. I would highly encourage you, no matter what life path you get on, whether for this or other purposes, to study the kinds of things you begin to study in high school speech, but which is only scratching the surface, about how to formulate arguments and approach them in ways that will strike people deeply as compelling. Logic, of course, is just how you think well and how thoughts fit together. If you have a solid sense of logic, you can spot on the one hand when you're hearing cases being made that don't actually make a lot of sense. Even if you're not paying attention, they would sound like they do. You can hear where things are falling apart. And on the other hand, you can start to construct arguments on your own because you recognize how logic works, and you can think of things that probably you haven't thought before, maybe they haven't thought before, where you can, again, start to build up a very compelling case because you know how to think well and how to communicate your thoughts well. So whatever you get into, do that. On this score, we're just going to kind of skip down through the sizing up the situation to some of the most frequent reasons people have for doubting the existence of God. Because what we're going to talk about here is this main question: is there even a God? And no, by the way, this is not the same as the question, is Christianity true? Because you can believe in a God and still not be a Christian, right? There's all kinds of people who do that. Most other religions believe there's some kind of higher power out there, and yet aren't Christian. And some people are very happy to believe that there's a God without subscribing to any particular religion. But there is a lot of people in all camps who at least occasionally wrestle with the question, but is there a reason for me to believe that he's there? And atheists, of course, atheism means know God, don't believe there is. So how can we talk to them? Let's take a scenario here. We're going to jump down. Well, actually, sorry. I'll go through the 5 most basic reasons people have that. On the one hand, there's what you might call rational grounds. That is to say, they have arguments about evidence out there objectively in the world, or philosophically logical arguments that seem to indicate that God does not sound like a reasonable idea. Okay? That one is a fairly straightforward thing. Well, those are the first two. Logic on the one hand, and real-world data. Another big one is they doubt it for moral reasons. They think that there's too much evil in the world, for one thing. And that is incompatible with the idea that there's some kind of God watching over all things. There's emotional reasons. Maybe they just, something about a God that they've heard about. Maybe they've had a really bad experience with somebody from the church, and therefore they thought, because this person is awful, and they believe in this God, I'm just repulsed by the idea of the God. It's not that they have a reason to doubt it, it's an emotional gut response of disgust from correlating the behavior of some follower of God with the idea of God itself. Does that make sense? And by the way, you will find those people probably are the most frequent, those last two, the people who have trouble believing in a God because of all the evil in the world, and people who have an emotional reaction against God. In fact, if you are conversing with atheists, you will almost always find, not always, but often find that their rational ideas, their real-world data that they appeal to, actually aren't the reasons they doubt God. They'll present those because those are the logically compelling ones, but at their heart, if you push them hard enough, they often go down to, I've had some really bad experience, or I just cannot tolerate this idea of this God who would act in this way that I don't personally agree with. So it's very often an emotional thing. And by the way, that's a very different kind of argument. When you're dealing with somebody who has emotional reasons for not believing in God, it's a little harder because you're not dealing with a rational argument. You can deal with the rational arguments, but that might not be enough to persuade them. And it's not easy. Well, have you ever met somebody who's angry? Is it easy to talk to them out of their being angry? No. How do you get them to stop being angry? Well, who knows? You just try stuff and see what sticks, basically. Usually when you're dealing with emotional resistance, the best course of action is be faithful, be diligent, be a good witness, that is, live consistently, so that they'll have emotional reasons, that is to say, to see that their previous emotional objections were wrong. Does that make sense? But we're not going to deal too much with those just because those are kind of hard to deal with because it's such a personal thing, and who knows how a person is going to react emotionally. Rather, I want to deal with more the intellectual, rational kinds of things. So let's jump down to this scenario. Let's say you're talking with someone who lets it slip that they are a staunch atheist. That is, I do not believe in the existence of any higher power, let alone a God. And their position is, I'm reading here if you want to look at it, there is no scientific evidence, and I'll even add there, or philosophical evidence for the existence of God. You Christians cannot offer any real proof that God exists, so I'm going to put my faith in what we know. What physics, what chemistry, what biology, what science proves. All right, so let's say you're dealing with somebody like that. First of all, have you ever had anybody like that you've met? Chances are fairly low in this community. How many of you are planning on going to college? Do you happen to know where you're hoping to go?
State Fair.
State Fair.
Back in the land of Columbia, you got a couple kids like that.
Well, there you go. Well, and by the way, community college is a very financially smart option.
That's what I'm saying.
But when you go to college, you are almost certainly going to meet more people who have these kinds of questions. Precisely because you're moving out into the world where people are exposed to a lot of different ideas. And in college, they're very, very, very much about scientific, rational, philosophical information, right? And it just needs to be said, most college campuses, most professors are going to even be not just neutral towards this, but anti-idea of Christianity and religion, and are especially science, biology, social studies departments tend to be led by professors, and this is just statistically true, you can look it up for yourself, who are not friendly to the usual Christian worldview. And they often will try to present you with scenarios and situations that will get you to question what you believe. And if you're not prepared to deal with any of this, well, how many of you question your teacher as being an idiot usually in school? You just assume they know what they're talking about. So maybe I'm just wrong. All right, so let's start with one very specific way of doing this. And I'm going to steal something from somebody I've read a lot of. And by the way, it's never a bad idea to steal good techniques from other worthwhile people. His name Warner Wallace. He's a cold case detective who was an atheist up until he's 35. He's actively cold case detective. He's very famous, worked on 48 Hours and all kinds of those kinds of things. And at 35, he decided he was going to study and apply the art of his discipline of marshaling evidence to make a case with Christianity, and lo and behold, he eventually became a Christian. But I put it not because his story is amazing, but because he has a very helpful way of boiling this down. He puts it like this: when I get called onto a case, say there's a death scene, they call it in, and now, if there's a dead body in the room, the question immediately becomes: is this a death scene, a suicide scene, an accident scene, or a murder scene? And you have to start figuring out, well, how can I determine what kind of case this is? And the biggest question you can ask about this is, can the death be explained by staying in the room, or would you have to leave the room to explain the death? So that is to say, if I'm looking at this dead body, it's laying there, and sorry if we're going to talk a little bit about these topics, hopefully it won't be too difficult for you. If it is, raise your hand, I guess. I don't know what I'll do, but we'll do something. So, for example, let's say you come in, there's John Smith laying down on the floor. There's a bottle of pills right next to his hand. There's a suicide note on his desk that's written in his handwriting, and his friends who you've interviewed said that he's been really depressed lately. That definitely is his handwriting. Would you need to leave the room to explain this death? Chances are pretty high, by pointing to all the evidence in the room, that there is the most rational explanation is in the room. That what transpired was clearly, or at least seems to be, he took pills that because he was wanting to kill himself. This is a suicide case. Now, is it possible that that's not what happened? Yeah. Obviously. The point, though, is not to establish that nothing else was possible, because almost anything is possible in imagination. You could imagine that a person slipped into the room, force-fed him a lot of pills, put him face down, after compelling him at gunpoint to write a suicide note. You could see it. Is that a reasonable conclusion to go to? Not unless there's some compelling evidence in the room that makes you think that happened. Like, I don't know, there's a big shoe print right next to his body that doesn't match his print. Okay, maybe that's a little different. But if you don't have evidence in the room that points to somebody outside the room, you stay inside the room. Okay? By the same token, let's say there's John Smith, there's a bottle of pills over there, there's a suicide note, but it's written in this weird handwriting that doesn't look like anything else he's written. There are a clear trail of footprints leading out of the room. Looks like the lock's been broken from the outside. Now, what kind of case do you probably have? Now, it could be something else explains this, but the evidence would make it reasonable to conclude that you you just can't explain everything in the room by staying inside the room. You have to figure out, okay, clearly these footprints are not from a source in the room. So where do we we have to leave the room to explain it. His point here is to say, when we're thinking about whether God exists or not, you can look at the universe and the world and basically all of the cosmos as the room. Can you explain everything in the room by staying in the room? That is to say, Can you follow all of the normal rules that explain everything that we know in the room? Chemistry, physics, biology, energy, thermodynamics, matter, all of these things. Can you explain them and from those things alone, talk about what's happened in the room, or do the things in the room compel you to assume that there is some kind of outside intruder that came into the room? Does that make sense what I'm saying? All right, how much time do I have? I don't have enough time to go into this detail. So we won't be able to make the case. We'll just start here. A lot of people you will hear say there is no evidence for God. And usually when they say that, they are making an assumption that is unexamined, that they can account for everything that goes on in this world by staying in the evidential confines of what's actually in this universe. And they act like you're the one who has the obligation to explain where everything came from, given how physics, chemistry, and everything works. But on the one hand, that's a false assumption that sneaks in a lot of assumptions about, well, how did chemistry, how did physics, how can they actually explain how we got here, how this world has gotten here? And there's actually a lot of huge problems with this from within the confines of a strictly chemical, physical, so on, materialist way of viewing the universe. For instance, there's the problem of origin. How do you explain how this universe first came to be here? Can you do that by staying in the room or not? I'm going to talk to you about how you really, logically, evidentially cannot. You actually have to leave the room, and if you don't, you are being logically, intellectually, scientifically inconsistent. Another big one, origin of life. How did anything that's alive get here? It's not actually as obvious as biologists like to claim. They usually just smuggle in a lot of assertions and pretend, and the basic contention is, well, we have no idea how now, but we're confident someday we'll be able to tell you, even though the evidence points in directions opposite of what the usual stories they tell you are. Third, consciousness. How do you get a being who is aware of the situation and able to perceive and make choices, a non-material consciousness out of material causes? That is not an easy thing to explain. It is one of the biggest problems in science and philosophy, and it always has been, and it just gets more and more serious the more they try to stay in the room. 5, the problem of evil. It is actually a serious conundrum how it is we even think there's such things as good and evil, and why we should try to be good and not evil, whether those are even sensible terms, if you stay inside the room. All of these, there's more we could go into, but those are 5 huge trouble spots for the idea that there is not really a God, that we can explain everything satisfactorily by staying in the room. And as we're going to start digging into next week, the things inside the room not only are failed to be explained by those things, but they actually point to, they are evidence for a positive case that there is an all-powerful, conscious, loving creator. Okay? But I can't go into that today because I'm out of time. So, I will leave the room.
Thank you, Pat.